So thank you so much for having me. It's a small audience, and I understand that many of you have had very busy days, whereas I've just gone to the Museum of the Dog today, so I haven't had a very stressful day at all. In fact, it was very amusing. So I'm going to try and be as entertaining as I can and keep you awake, even though that might sacrifice some of the kind of academic language. So is that okay? We go the lightweight version. So I want to give you a little bit of context for where I am today in my head. So some of you might be aware that there are massive bushfires on the east coast of Australia. When I mentioned this to the person I'm staying with in the Airbnb, he said, oh, whatever, it always burns there, and he didn't quite understand my anxiety. So this is the map of all the fires that are currently burning in New South Wales. This is from actually yesterday. And I'm particularly interested in this fire here, which is this one. And the reason that I'm very interested in it, very preoccupied and concerned about it, is I have a property right here. So as you can see, it's moved down this valley and it's probably a mile from our property. My concern is not just about our property. We are in the middle of building a house there, and it's just the concrete slabs and some steel lying around. So we would lose as much as other people at the moment. The concern is that when we bought that property, we bought it because it was the wettest place in the state. So this is Upper Coopers Creek, this is our creek, this is our beach, and it gets 91 inches of rain a year. So that is more than Hawaii, which is the US's wettest state. Hawaii gets 63 inches. Seattle, where I've spent quite a bit of time, only gets 38 inches. And when I was in Seattle, I thought it rained non-stop. So this is a very, very wet place. It's subtropics. It usually looks like this. It rains all the time. So what's burning there at the moment is rainforest. And this is the first time that forest has ever burned in its entire history, not just of white occupation. So I think we're all going to have these moments over the next few decades of now it's really close to me, not just fire, but the impact of climate change. And the Australian government, they're a Conservative government at the moment, instead of recognising this as an opportunity to gather people and enact some change, have consistently denied that climate change is behind these fires, even though all this scientific evidence is there. What interests me in this political argument is that everything that we will do over the next few weeks to recover from the fires and deal with the fires while they're on relies on scientific progress, on scientific knowledge that's been developed in laboratories, whether that is skin grafts of people that are being burnt, whether that's for veterinary treatment for the thousands of koalas who have been burnt. All of this is scientific knowledge which has been developed in laboratory buildings. And yet, on the other hand, scientific knowledge, some aspects of scientific knowledge are considered controversial. So science is at a very interesting point. It's been in a very difficult point, I think, for the last 5 decades of trying to persuade people about scientific knowledge. So we've had the science wars, we've had a lot of discussion of science as culturally constructed, as socially constructed, and that's been incredibly useful and good work from people like Bruno Latour. But then we have others who are manipulating that argument for their own ends. So the laboratory building, because of where science is at, is as significant to the 21st century as the cathedral was to the 13th or the 14th centuries. So scientific knowledge has largely displaced theology. I know there are people who still have religious beliefs, but in many ways, science has replaced philosophical speculation and theology as a framework for understanding life and the universe. The privileged status of science is reflected in the policies that many governments have for developing research, for constructing new buildings, for new precincts, for new campaigns, for new research opportunities. And the budgets that have come with laboratory building over the last 2 decades are sufficiently generous for these buildings to fulfil the particular ambitions and conceits of architects, clients and occupants. Indeed, for even the most preposterous ideas and luxurious fantasies to be realised. So we might learn much about the biosciences from architecture. For here, the sciences are given their most legible, their most insistent and most nuanced articulation. But I think also as architects, we can learn a lot about architecture from the laboratory buildings for biosciences. We can learn about its potential, its expressive force, its social effects, and its disciplinary assumptions. So architecture is here a symptom of the forces that work through and upon it. Architecture also structures and produces a desire and plays a part in the disciplining of subjectivities, in making scientific and scientist identities. And I'm going to come back to this point. So laboratory buildings architecture is all this and more. But many people, however, imagine the laboratories as warrens, I'm quoting, warrens of endless corridors and closed doors behind which new discoveries are squirreled away. Or, quoting another critic, an unloved type where boffins are thought never to look up from their experiments or talk to one another. So we still have very stereotyped ideas about what a scientist is and where they work that date back, I think, to the alchemical laboratory. So this leap from the anonymous prefab shed housing a functional stack of labs and pipes to today's architectural edifices is much overdrawn. Indeed, new laboratories are far less concerned with pragmatics than they are with persuasion and socialisation. So when we have a look at some laboratory buildings, we can see that there are incredible semi-public spaces for socialisation, collaboration, presentation and persuasion, and these are now taking up a much greater proportion of laboratory buildings than the wet laboratory spaces. These spaces are platforms for the scientists to engage in fundraising, in team building, educational research and outreach, media wrangling, community liaison and public relations. So we find in these buildings dramatic atria, sculptural stairs, circulation routes incorporating conversation nooks and views into the laboratories. No longer hidden away, bioscience laboratories now occupy prime real estate, perhaps none more so than this particular building, the Parc de Becerca. I'm not going to say that because there are Spanish people in the room. The PRBB, where its scientists play volleyball on the beach. And fortunately, one of the great things about studying laboratory buildings, we had an Australian Research Council grant, and I was doing the research with my colleague Chris Smith, and we got to visit this building and then have a swim afterwards. That was one of my favourite field trips. The novelty of the bioscience laboratory today is that architecture is regarded as a means to achieve organisational aims. Architecture is engaged to recruit star scientists, to inspire young people to embark upon careers in science and attract philanthropy and industry partners. It is architecture that sponsors conversation and collaboration between scientists and enhances, supposedly, the performance and health of employees, and thus accelerates discovery. Architecture is charged with engaging the public in scientific endeavours. In this building in London, the scientists are working in the basement while the pods for the public are suspended over the top and you can look down at the scientists. In this way, you're meant to understand science. So architecture literally engages the public through spaces in which advancement and industry participation might be hosted, as well as by communicating the importance and supposedly the content of scientific research. These ambitions respond to a diverse array of ideological and economic forces encompassing neoliberal concepts of knowledge work, the reification of innovation, and the free market entrepreneur. They also, of course, respond to technological change and to shifting financial institutions and structures. They respond to the corporatisation of universities and the concomitant uptake of collegial organisation in industry. We also see the growth of speculative real estate development in the provision of science facilities. So my investment tip for any of you, if you want to make money on the stock market, is to invest in the real estate of bioscience laboratories. This is in fact where all the money is being made. Belief in science as a means of addressing ageing, indeed mortality itself, and other big problems also fuels the growth in biosciences research. Every nation state, from Botswana to Bolivia, from Russia to Brazil, has official policies for the promotion of biosciences research and development. Laboratories have become sites of power and prestige, of faith and ambition. They are places that link nations into the global trade of scientific knowledge. The contemporary research laboratory has joined the museum and the art gallery as a building type deserving of a prominent site and a signature architect. Iconic treatment and civic pride, public investment and private philanthropy. So it used to be that Pritzker Prize architecture winners got their Pritzkers after they had designed a laboratory building. These days, governments and private corporations invest in architects who've already got Pritzker Prizes. Every laboratory architect, every laboratory client declares the same three aspirations. So when you look across numerous laboratory buildings, no matter what they look like and who's designed them, there are three things that the architects and the scientists say about them, about their ambitions. They say, our building eliminates boundaries between the public and between scientists and other scientists. And they do that through transparency and openness. Sometimes they go as far as eliminating the wall between the laboratory and the writing area with very strange effects, such as this little meeting room. The second thing they say is that the building will communicate the potential benefits and interest of its research programs. The third thing that is said is that the laboratory building will foster collaboration amongst its scientists. So if you read any rhetoric about laboratory buildings, you'll find that architectural determinism is alive and well in that sector. They share too a core purpose and an inner organ, the wet lab, and this varies very little. This is due to the constraints that arise from the observance of experimental protocols, of complex service requirements, the need for even and bright artificial light, particular kinds of finishes that are impermeable, anti-corrosive, as well as the standardisation of equipment. So there's just like 5 or 6 companies that produce laboratory benches and equipment. Everyone buys from the same companies. And it's a little bit like an ambulance. You want the scientist to be able to walk in, no matter what ambulance that is, and be able to operate it. So there's that standardisation of equipment that happens in laboratory buildings. So they all pretty much look the same. I probably didn't even need to show you those images to show you. You would have imagined what they look like. And it is this comparative stasis of the bench space for experimentation that has seen laboratories described as all the same, more or less, and as constituting a universal cultural space. Yet when we look at laboratory buildings, they are irreconcilable as a transistor radio, a cordless shaver, or an electric bicycle. Those 3 gadgets all have batteries, but they do completely different things. They look very different. They've all got similar inner workings. It's the same with laboratory buildings. So we see ones like these. This is the Alexandria Life Sciences Centre. It's a bio-realty, so it's built as a development for lease. and other kind of mid-rise towers in cities. This Alexandria Life Science Centre, does anyone know it? This building? You've seen it? Yeah, good. Buildings that are indistinguishable from the corporate office buildings around them. We see buildings like this that are pride of place on university campus. We also see laboratory buildings like this very strange one, the Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory on Long Island, which looks supposedly like a ski village, an alpine village with its quaint domestic buildings. We see that they vary a great deal in size, from a couple of rooms to major pieces of civic or here rural infrastructure. They can be found in urban biosciences precincts, rural settings, in coastal resorts. And internally, the organisation of wet laboratories varies widely from being stacked vertically, ranged in a horizontal line or radially, located below or high above ground, on display or deeply buried behind other spaces. This is the Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory. This is the wrong way to design a laboratory in terms of efficiency and socialisation, but their main objective was to hide the laboratory. So they are subterranean. It's a very complex bit of circulation. There is signage everywhere so that people don't get lost, even though they've been working there for some time. If we look at a bunch of laboratory buildings together, the blue is the wet labs, you can see how varied they are in their organisation. There's circulation too. This is again the Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory with its complex vertical and horizontal circulation, and a bunch of other laboratory buildings. If we go back to the analogy of the cathedral was seen to have a kind of stable type, a typology. Could we say that laboratory buildings have such a thing? Absolutely not. There is no cathedral ideal. Why are today's laboratories so radically different from their modernist predecessors and from each other? How do architectural differences between laboratories emerge? And what are the effects of these differences? These questions are not unlike those faced by Charles Darwin on contemplating the myriad forms of animal and plant life. The puzzle demands more than, say, ascribing the turtle shell to its need for protection. Linking form to function does not explain how or why the turtle took this route rather than the articulated carapace of the lobster or the aardvark. In other words, it requires that we ask about the mechanisms and forces of change in the entire biosciences ecosystem. So to understand why these laboratories all look so different and have taken different directions, we need to understand the relations between them and the forces upon them. We need to understand the laboratory's adaptation to and fitness for the complex environments in which it competes for scientists, funds, and industry partners. I'm going to unpack that introduction by looking at just one laboratory building, and this is where the fun begins. So the laboratory building that we're going to look at closely and try and see in terms of its forces upon it and why it developed the way it did is the J. Craig Venter Institute in La Jolla, California. Who's heard of Craig Venter? Nobody? Okay. So Craig Venter is like a rock star in science. He is the one who decoded the genome. In 1998, Craig Venter provocatively announced that he was forming a private company that within 3 years would unravel the genetic code of life, and so it did. 7 years before the completion of the state-funded Human Genome Project. So he got in there first. Having read DNA, Venter claimed that the next stage is to write it. For this, he needs a laboratory and office that persuades investors of the viability and consequences of his personal and organisational mission. It is this complex ecosystem of knowledge, financial speculation and architecture that close examination of the J. Craig Venter Institute reveals and makes concrete. So we're going to take seriously Deleuze's contention that capital is a semiotic operator and examine how financial, architectural and photographic artefacts function in biotech business and in the production of subjectivity. And I'm going to come back to this particular image of Craig Venter advertising a watch. So the JCVI, that's what its acronym is. Its headquarters and laboratories were designed by Zimmer, Gunzel, Frasker Architects, a practice that I'd never heard of, but they're a big practice founded in Portland, Oregon in 1942. The construction cost was $48 million, and ZGF's fees for its design in 2013 were $726,000. This was actually just $18,000 more than Venter's annual salary that year from the JCVI. So he's chosen a more lucrative career than you have. The firm is the 9th highest earning architecture firm in the USA in the science and technology sector, with revenue in 2013, when this was built, of over $10 million. So the location is very much to do with San Diego, inviting Craig Venter back to build his institution there. He had been an alumni. And of course, he was very keen. He was given 2 sites. He chose an elevated site rather than one that was closer to the Salk Institute. And he constructed this building, which I'm going to spend some time analysing. Ted Hyman, the LA-based partner of ZGF, recalls, it is unlikely that the architects have read Lazzarato on immaterial labour, cooperation and the production of subjectivity by business and state in advanced capitalism. Nevertheless, the mottos on their homepage suggest that they understand completely, albeit uncritically, the imperatives of their clients. The architects serve a lifestyle discourse that supports the workplace in neoliberalism, and they do it exceptionally well. Ted Hyman, the LA-based partner of ZGF, recalls that Venter wanted a place for collaboration and breakthrough research in a high-performance facility that would inspire the design of laboratory buildings in the future. This is kind of standard stuff that architects say about their laboratory buildings. And Hyman reports from there, and there's a little bit of a leap, the idea of a net zero energy laboratory building was born. At first glance, and by the architect's own reckoning, the architecture is a technical response to a set of performance parameters against which the building's success can be numerically quantified. Much of the machinery for achieving LEED certification is ostentatiously visible, such as the bicycle racks and the photovoltaic panels. For Venter, and I'm quoting him, the Institute's unique design melds the environmental philosophies of our genomic research with sustainability goals. And this is a really key point. The design melds the environmental philosophies of our genomics research with sustainability goals. But in fact, Venter has publicly expressed doubts about the mechanical approach to sustainability, stating, "I wanted to do more than just using less oil and gas or installing a solar panel. I felt that genomics has something unique to offer." But symbolically, he needs solar panels because his research depends on the recognition of human-caused environmental degradation. Ventus research that requires the identification of problems for which environmental genomics is the answer. He believes, and I quote, "We've reached the stage where our globe is 100% dependent on science for its future." In short, the design of the JCVI participates in the social construction of climate change as a problem to be solved by more and better science and technology, rather than, say, behaviour change or political disruption. So I'm sure some of you have seen the site Drawdown, right? Drawdown does not list human genomics and Ventus' work as one of the key top 10 things to do in the next few years. It's got educating women and girls way above that. But Hyman also reports that Craig Venter came to us with the goal of designing the Salk Institute of the 21st century. That says something about his sense of self. Both Jonas Salk and Venter are quite unusual in being able to occupy, while still alive, purpose-built, legacy scientific premises dedicated to their past contributions and the future trajectories of their vision. But the client and architect relationship has not led to architectural experimentation, but rather to quotation. So knowing a little bit about Craig Venter as the rock star of the West Coast science scene, you could imagine other architects more suitable for him to engage than ZGF. ZGF's design utilises the same raw teak walls and exposed concrete and even the same builder as the Salk. But where Kahn's design foregrounded the offices of the lead scientist, it did so in a way that promised, if not delivered, their democratic engagement as a collective, with offices of equal size and prominence. So this is the site. Have a guess where Venter's office is. Now you know a little bit about him. This is the road, this is the view. I'm sure you can guess. So his office is here. The building has a courtyard, and unlike the Salk, where the courtyard opens to the landscape, the wing turns around so that his office obscures the view for everybody else. So when we are standing in that courtyard, what we see is his office deck and his office. So given the building's pivotal and prominent location at the heart of one of the world's richest concentrations of biosciences research investment, its location on a ridge overlooking other institutions, given this, the siting of Venter's large office is particularly pertinent. It sits at the prow of the administration and facilities wing, at the furthest distance from the main entry, and is the only office with ocean views. Indeed, as we saw, it obscures the views from the courtyard. Every other room is in effect a kind of antechamber, there to dramatise and prolong the procession the visitor or the employee makes from entry to their audience with Venter. This is a tactic quite common in 16th and 17th century royal palaces. In this respect, the JCVI at La Jolla becomes the stage and the scaffolding for Venter's performance as the scientist who would save the world. But the most important semiotic layer can be found in the interior of his office. So there's his office there. It's a larger office than yours, Lydia. That has a spectacular view, and you don't have room for vintage motorbikes in yours. Soon after the completion of the JCVI in 2014, Ventus was photographed in his new office by Michael Lewis for the Harvard Business Review series Life's Work. Shortly thereafter, he modelled in his study for the prestige timepiece company ZGS in a campaign shot by Kurt Iswarienko. So here is the Michael Lewis photograph, and if you go to Getty Images, Michael Lewis photographed a series of images. You can see a colour one where Ventus looks straight at the camera. That's the one available with the Getty Images, and the dog is looking away. But the one that was chosen for the Harvard Business Review has Ventus gazing into the distance and the dog looking at the camera. I'll come back to this. And here is, again, the photograph that was taken by Kurt Iswarienko. So now I can test your popular culture knowledge. Does anyone know who Kurt Iswarienko is? Okay. He is married to an actress from Beverly Hills 90210, the old series, Shannon Doherty. No?
Yes.
Okay, so Kurt Iswarienko is Shannon Doherty's partner. And, you know, once I started looking him up, I fell down the rabbit hole of the internet gossip because it's fascinating. A very interesting relationship. Anyway, he promised that he would send me this photograph and didn't, but so that's the best I have. Both of these photographs use the conventional setting of a man seated alone in his study to convey what we have learned to call immaterial labour. Now, of course, the study, furnished with artefacts that narrate achievements and personal qualities in a semi-naturalistic manner, has long been employed as a symbol of knowledge work. Take, for example, Albrechier's etching St. Jerome in his study of 1514 and other paintings of the era on the subject. These depictions come at a time when man's existence was moved to the centre of philosophical concerns, when the fashioning of a life and one's own destiny was sanctioned. This idea of self-invention made portraiture a performance. The 19th century saw the architectural interior as an unavoidable exteriorisation of the psychic interior. The subject attempts to control his or her self-image through design and deportment, but is then betrayed by gestures, objects, and expressions that escape her consciousness. I think you've all experienced this when you've got a visitor, an important visitor coming to your house for the first time, and you tidy up. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, I better get that book, that embarrassing book I read, off my bookshelf, because then they might know that actually I'm reading this rather than this. And you curate your bookshelf ready for your visitor. That idea of the interior representing your interior is an old one. The corollary of this idea is that the astute viewer can impute personality and state of mind, as well as occupation, social class, and taste from the room in which a subject is portrayed. This assumption that a person's home or workplace is revelatory and authentic continues today in the genre known as environmental portrait photography. And it's this idea that motivates these two photographs of Ventus. Yet, of course, one office is entirely staged to convey a gentlemanly persona that serves the ZGS brand. The other photograph, although in Ventus' actual office in the JCVI, is no more authentic in conveying his true self. So if we look at these two images again, that one and that one, which one conveys Ventus' true self. The design and decoration of the office, overseen by the architects, is motivated by its anticipated role in exactly this sort of portrayal. Not only through the medium of photography, but also as Ventus engages with employees and visitors, and most contentiously, of course, himself. While his office is so crammed with objects that it recalls the Wunderkammer, a precursor to the laboratory, this plenitude should not be mistaken for intimacy or disclosure. And I'll come back to the brain. You might notice that here is the skull in the traditional one, and in Ventus it is a 3D print of his brain. The room is furnished to underline Ventus' achievements and assert his passion for risk-taking sports and speed. It is a means of scaffolding and staging a desired persona, that of the maverick scientist come entrepreneur, and I think it's as accurately targeted at its audience as the Jaeger LeCoultre study is targeted at theirs. So who is Ventus posing for, and who is the office posing for? Who is that audience? So I want to look at Ventus' business model. So one of Ventus' most trailblazing contributions to science, as well as the decoding the human genome, has been the design of a business model that twins non-profit basic research organisations with for-profit companies. So he sets up a non-for-profit research organisation and he sets up for-profit private organisations. This model enables a swift transition of scientific discoveries into marketable products that in turn donate funds back to the not-for-profits to fuel further research. So you donate to a not-for-profit, it's a tax. There's a tax incentive. So let's have a look at his company. The J. Craig Ventus Science Foundation, that's the not-for-profit, was launched in April 2002, merging 3 of the 5 not-for-profit research companies that Ventus had previously established. He personally gave the foundation a $100 million plus endowment that he'd taken from the profits of a previous venture, Solera. Simultaneously, he sought venture capital for research through a for-profit company called Synthetic Genomics, which he launched in 2005 and is today its chairman. So he heads up both of these, the research and Synthetic Genomics. Synthetic Genomics pays for about 25 of the JCVI's roughly 300 researchers and has rights to their discoveries. By 2010, the company had an imputed valuation of over 500 million, of which Ventus owns 15%. And around 400 million of that came from corporate companies. So Synthetic Genomics has 3 wholly owned subsidiaries: SGI DNA, Synthetics Genome Vaccine, and Genovia Bio. You can see some of the partners here. You'd recognise some of those names, no doubt. SGVI is focused on the development of synthetic vaccines, and it includes a program in partnership with the pharma conglomerate Novartis. Genovia's mission is to develop bio-based consumer-friendly products which are sustainable and economically advantaged, and it received 300 million from ExxonMobil to research and produce algal biofuels. There's a 4th subsidiary that's focused on agriculture, which was bought out by Monsanto. Coincident So having once declared that healthcare should be the least of our worries, given the graver challenge of climate change, in 2014, Ventus formed a new company focused on ageing, which is called Human Longevity Inc., HLI. And it's got a byline, which I think is probably the most cynical thing that I've ever read, which reads, "Ageing is the single biggest risk factor for virtually every significant human disease." I mean, it's a kind of hilarious thing to say. Getting old is the thing that is most correlated to disease. So what are you going to do about that? You're going to cure ageing. You're going to stop people ageing. And it's incredibly cynical because, of course, if you did cure ageing, then something else would be the single biggest risk factor. There's always going to be something. Anyway. Ventus for-profit organisations reside in leased accommodation. So let's have a look at the buildings where the for-profit, the commercial companies reside. They're in buildings like this, buildings that are oblivious to even the simplest fuel reduction strategy. And the environmental impact is further compounded by the vast tracts of distance between them that Ventus and his colleagues must regularly drive or fly. So synthetic genomics is in this one, which is about 3 miles from the laboratory of JCVI. It's fully air conditioned. It's got unprotected reflective glass, curtain window walls, precast concrete panels. There's no bus or public transport there. His 240 scientists and staff on the East Coast are in Rockville, Maryland. They occupy 5 buildings of similar ilk, which are leased from Biomed Realty Trust. They're also the owners of the property that Human Longevity occupies in San Diego. Biotech real estate is a huge business with better returns than investing in biotech itself. Oh, this is where I have to go rogue. Having printed that off at a friend's place. So, who's his audience? So I think his audience is threefold. There are his employees, and all of them are on 1-year contracts. It doesn't hurt to keep them in a kind of like a position of subordination in being kind of, terrified to go to the headmaster's office. So here is his office. He also has meetings with occasionally kind of, this was really particularly for newspapers. He met with a young girl who has had cancer and did a kind of display of empathy. His colleagues and the architect, this guy's worked with him for decades and is still on 1-year contracts. Then there are people like this. Friends who are also investing in entrepreneurial companies. All right, I'm going to see if I do have my notes because I don't remember their names. One of these guys is mining asteroids, and I don't remember what the other one's doing. But they're basically angel investors speculating in companies similar to Ventus, and they're his partners in Human Longevity Inc. So this one has a site where he's talking about how to invest in tech. And these guys, they understand the kind of risk phenomena that is Ventus. They're the sort of, if you're going to mine asteroids and that's your company, you're not going to be too worried about risk. You're going to understand a guy who gets out on his motorbike and does, laps around at high speed. You're going to understand that person. But there are also people like Genting, which is a used to be called Starships. It's a big, big company, highly diversified. They own casinos in the US, they own shipping lines, they own tourism. It's a Malaysian company, and for them, they need reassurance. What do they need reassurance about from the office? So when Ventus had Solera, this was the company he set up after decoding the human genome to capitalise in on that discovery. When he set up that company, you can see that its stock price was nuts, right? People were throwing money at it. It was super, super exciting, lots and lots of money. And then when he said, well, I'm going to patent the human genome, I'm going to patent genetic decoding, there was an intervention by both the Blair government and, at the time, I think the Bush government, would it be? Or Clinton, possibly Clinton. They both said, actually, we're going to make it illegal to privatise the genome. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to patent genomic discoveries. And the stock market for Solera crashed. He was deposed as its chairman. He did take out that money and he started all over again. So it's a very risky business, biosciences research. And when you've got someone like this ahead of it, you know, you need some reassurance. And the office does that. The office does that in quite specific ways. So if you've got big corporations, whether it's Genting or whether it's Exxon, how do you both create the idea of kind of risk and adventure, but also that someone is completely in charge of things? You do it like this. So you make sure that every award is on the wall, every single award. Then you combine it with the motorbikes. Then you combine it with the brain. So the whole office is a performance to try and appeal to the various different kinds of audiences. It's a really tricky performance for Ventus to do. So that's just one laboratory building. It's a laboratory building that is seriously a portrait of its chairperson. Let's have a look just quickly at some others so you can see how different they are. So here's Ventus with Watson. Watson has forgiven him. At one time, Watson called Ventus something like an ape. He basically said Ventus' process of decoding human genome could be run by apes, which was, you know, incredibly rude. But here they are at a party. So if we have a look at James Watson's laboratory, which is the Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory, the one that you saw that looked like an alpine village, where does it get its money from? It's a very, very different funding group. So the Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory is basically owned by the neighbours, by its Long Island neighbours, who are all mostly operators in New York who have second homes where their families are there on that Gold Coast. People like this. So for Watson and the Cold Spring Harbour Laboratory, their architectural ambition is to make those buildings look like old buildings, like the houses that their board and their donors live in. So it's a disguised laboratory. It's meant to look like, you know, a kind of elite college. So Watson spends his time going to gala dinners, or did. He's now in his 90s, so he's probably winding down on the dining. He's going to gala dinners with his board, people who have a lot of money to give, who've mostly made that in finance. So this person chairs the board, and This is the hall that her and her partner, Francis Biondo, donated. So you can see that's a very strange laboratory campus. When we look at the difference between that one, this is the courtyard for Cold Spring Harbour, and this is the courtyard for Ventus. These are very different operations. When we look at the houses that they live in, these houses are of the same era. In fact, actually this one is a little older than this one. This is by Centrebrook Architects, who also designed the laboratory building. It's a reproduction, Georgian. That's Watson's house. If we have a look closer to Manhattan and we look at a bioscientist like Nina Tandon, she has a company called Epibone. She's doing 3D printed bone that's made of real bone cells. That's her project. She also needs lots and lots of funding. She's got funding from Peter Thiel's startup grants, and she originally started her company Epibone in the Harlem biospace, which is a small, like a cooperative working environment for laboratory. Really different environments. And we can see here that there's a kind of ecosystem of research. This becomes even clearer when we look at the Alexandria Life Sciences development. So the Alexandria Life Sciences development got lots of incentives from the New York Development Fund, including some free land and some support and tax breaks, but on condition that they also develop a space for young researchers. So this is their foyer, and the Alexandria towers are largely occupied by big pharma companies, but they have a small space, a cooperative laboratory space, which you can see here. This is intended for young experimental graduates who are coming from other places and is trying to kind of pull them from Boston, to bring them to New York to create a kind of pipeline of research here. And incredibly patronising. You can see here there's a game of, what is that? Connect Four on the table, like a kind of decorative piece, as if these are kind of kindergarten kids. So really different sense of who the audience is and who the architecture is to appeal to. So this is what we have done looking at the laboratory buildings, is to try and understand each one in its very specific context, in terms of its funding, in terms of the people who work there, the identities that they need to portray, and how those identities are used to construct a demand for their research and to bring in a community of thing around them. So, given I have gone over the last bit rather quickly, I hope that you have time to read more. It's in the book, which comes out on Friday. So thank you.